how Greece's debt was going to be reduced, because it's now basically admitted that Greece can't actually repay the sovereign debt that it has. It's just far too large. So they walked away from the talks on how that debt might be reduced, on the grounds that they were being asked to contribute too much, that Greece's creditors were being asked to take too much of a hit, that the write-off, the restructuring was going to be too much, and so they walked out of the talks there. Now, that's serious for the reason that about 140 billion euros is due from Greece in March, and the country's in no real state to pay that. So unless they have some kind of arrangement in place to reduce the amount of money that's due there and then, Greece will have little choice but to default, but to say it can't pay its debt. And this will be the first time this has happened in any kind of developed country in the last 60 years, really since the Second World War. And it certainly hasn't happened for a large kind of European country for very, very, very many years. It's quite a dramatic event. And of course, there's all sorts of consequences that can follow from this afterwards. So that's the first one. You find that the Greek talks, which everyone previously had been saying, no, it's all going to be fine, we're going to negotiate our way through this, collapsed. The second one was the leaked news, really, followed up by the interview today, that Ed Balls has decided that he accepts both the pay freeze for public sector workers that George Osborne's introduced, so that's everybody in the public sector gets their pay frozen, which actually means a big pay cut every year for the next, I think it's 5 years. And he accepts now, this is Ed Balls, accepts every cut, is the language that he was using. Though instead of opposing austerity and opposing the programme of cuts that the government wants to introduce, Ed Balls and the Labour leadership, and obviously Ed Miliband was earlier in the week saying exactly the same thing, is saying that in order to look credible on the economy, we sort of have to agree with everything, and this is ludicrous in and of itself, we have to agree with everything that George Osborne, that wonderfully credible Chancellor, is saying about the economy. We will just do exactly the same things, but because we're Labour, we have values and we'll do it more nicely than the Tories would manage, which, you know, is heartening. When you find out that it's a Labour council or a Labour government with values that's closing down your local services, rather than a Tory government, which is obviously cruel, heartless, evil people who have no values and no respect for anything whatsoever. And this has been the line that the Labour leadership have developed now over the last week or so. So that's the second thing. The third one is what Standard & Poor, which is one of the big three credit rating agencies, decided to do late on Friday, after the markets had closed, so as not to kind of frighten the horses, which is basically to say that 9 European countries, we now think, Standard & Poor now think, are at greater risk of default than they were in the past. They think it is more likely, not much more likely, but enough more likely, that a number of European countries will default, that will downgrade their credit ratings. And the critical one in this is France. France is a country, it's a very large economy. It's one of the top 10 in the world. I think it's number 7 at the moment. It's absolutely central to the European project. It's a very large developed country with quite a large debt, and it is somewhere that hasn't defaulted on its national debt since 1812. This is one of the about 6 countries worldwide that have not defaulted on their debt in the last 150 years or so. So to say that France is now in a situation where it may have to default on its debt, or at least the risk of it doing so has increased appreciably, is actually to say something really quite serious. And of course this comes directly out of the continuing crisis inside the European Union. I want to talk a little bit like that because it kind of determines all the other things that are happening, even in Britain, which is outside the Eurozone. Because what you're looking at inside the European Union now, I think, and inside the Eurozone, is a situation essentially where the debt has built up so much that it's more or less unpayable. It's certainly unpayable in Greece. It is likely to become unpayable inside other countries as well. So Portugal, Spain, possibly Italy, although that really would be quite cataclysmic if it's the case, and Ireland are the obvious ones that leap to mind there, that so much public debt has developed that these countries are not in a position to ever plausibly repay it. They're not in a position to ever plausibly repay it because the European economy is stagnating. All the forecasts now are either stagnation for the next year or even a decline, certainly a decline in the case of Greece and some of the other peripheral European countries. None of these places are going to be able to repay their debt. It is therefore highly likely that at some point some kind of restructuring of the debt has to take place. Now the reason this has serious consequences is because that debt that they owe is itself held inside other European countries. In particular, it's held inside European banks and European financial institutions. So if they default on the debt, these financial institutions as creditors for that debt take a big hit. they lose out. They lose out quite substantially, potentially quite substantially. In the case of Italy, it could be catastrophic. This is a country that has 1.4 trillion euros worth of debt sitting around the place. If it defaults on that, that is an enormous blow to the financial system. It is likely that you then get another round of financial crises, and it's likely, of course, if you have another round of financial crises, that you get the same demands to bail out the banks and therefore develop more public debt over here. Essentially, the system can't really bear any of these things. So what you're looking at is a kind of long, slow-burn crisis with the possibility of another financial crisis developing over the next year or so. And that will immediately affect, of course, the UK, which has a huge financial centre in the City of London, which is deeply entangled with debt right away across Europe, and which is itself a country that is trapped by low growth and by austerity. And that's exactly the austerity that, by the way, Ed Balls and the Labour leadership have now said they'd sign up to. And just to go quickly through the argument on this, austerity makes this situation worse. It makes it more, not less likely that you'll be able to, that you'll have to default on your debt. It makes it harder for you to meet the repayments on your debt, and it makes it harder for you to do this because basically it trashes the real economy. If you cut government spending in an economy that is weak, that is in a recession, or that is stagnating, you withdraw demand from that economy. If you pull demand out of that economy, people sell less, firms sell less. If firms sell less, they lay people off, they cut wages. If people are laid off and they have their wages cut, they spend less, and that in turn reduces demand in the economy, which sets up a horrible, vicious circle. That's what's happening inside Europe right now, very dramatically in the case of Greece, less dramatically for some of the other European countries, and it's starting to happen here. This is why Britain is currently, essentially the first reason why Britain is stagnating, and it's why it's likely that we'll all go back into an actual recession, see an actual shrinking of the economy over the next year or so. So austerity produces the stagnation, and the stagnation means that you can't repay your debt. And if you can't repay your debt, the risk of default increases. If the risk of default increases, the risk of another financial crisis increases also. That's the mechanism at work here. And of course, if the risk of another financial crisis increases, the risk is that the banks turn back to their governments and say, you need to bail us all out, and if you need to bail us all out, we will in turn have to pay for the cost of this, and it's another round of austerity. This is a very, very desperate situation to get trapped into. Now, the fact that the Labour leadership has basically said, instead of opposing all of this, I mean, never mind the kind of economic logic of it, just a simple sort of electoral calculation you might have thought would say, we're going to oppose austerity because in the first instance, it hits the people who are supposed to vote for us. The fact that they've turned their back on this, I think, is quite a dramatic moment. It's quite a turning point for the Labour Party as a whole, and certainly for all of us involved in any kind of anti-cuts work. For the Labour Party as a whole, it's not the same as Iraq, I don't think. And I don't think it's that kind of weird sort of corrupt adventure that Tony Blair decided to launch around the war on terror. It's not an aberration for the Labour Party to be doing this. It's not something that Labour leadership has gone mad and it's just decided to tie itself as closely as possible, in the case of Tony Blair, to something that America was doing for reasons that can be quite separate from what the Labour Party may or may not otherwise do. I think what you're seeing at the moment is the end of a long process of a decay in the Labour Party where it turns away increasingly from any kind of attachment to its historic roots, from any kind of attachment to the welfare state, for instance, which is, when you get down to it, the Labour Party's kind of sole really big achievement. It is the thing that it did. It was the party that introduced the welfare state and the NHS and education, all the rest of it, as we now know it. And if it turns its back on that, it's basically trashing everything it ever stood for. So that's what the Labour leadership has done. But this comes at the end of a decade-long process of turning its back on what the Labour Party used to stand for. So it's quite a moment, I think, for the Labour Party as a whole, more than just the immediate thing of this means that Labour leadership is not going to supply any kind of lead to the anti-cuts movement. More than that, I think it's also the kind of end of the line for an argument about why Labour might be something worth supporting. Why, if you want to change the world, then you should be in the Labour Party. I think at this point, a line has been drawn, and that argument doesn't really any longer hold. So I think there's a couple of things from that general background. Actually, there's one more thing to throw into all this, because in the midst of the chaos that is the world economy, the general crisis and the rest of it, somewhat incredibly, I mean really stupefyingly actually, over the last year and accelerating in the last few months, there has been an insistent and growing drumbeat about why we need to go to war with Iran, why we need to attack Iran, why Iran is such a terrible, desperate threat to us, and then continually a kind of drip, drip, drip of propaganda about Iran, and continually, at the same time, military manoeuvres being performed around Iran, attempts to impose sanctions. Continually, you find weird little reports of explosions in Iran, of nuclear scientists being assassinated, just this continual ratcheting up of tensions at the same time as, of course, you have a major economic crisis. So just to sort of throw that into the mix of what we're looking at the start of the year, the picture is not particularly pleasant, I think it's fair to say. So out of this, what do you do? I think there's three things that we have to go through. The first one is the Stop the War Coalition has quite rightly said that we need to prioritise saying we're opposed to attacking Iran. People have gone through the experience of Iraq. They know what happened with that. They know what is likely to happen if any attack in Iran or any military moves are made against Iran over the near future. I think we will find out there an awful lot of people who do precisely remember the kind of nonsense we saw in the run-up to the attack in Iraq, which is exactly what we're now seeing in the run-up to the attack in Iran, that they will understand the argument about why you don't do this, but we have to get out there and start to organise it a bit. The Stop the War Coalition has called a demonstration at the US Embassy saying don't attack Iran, don't attack Syria on the 28th of January. I think we have to make it a priority to try and get people there. I think it's important that we start to move in this because as mad as it sounds, as dangerously stupid, as foolhardy as it sounds, I think it's increasingly looking like these people are quite serious about this and that we are being led down a path that leads you towards an attack in Iran, that leads you to war at some point in the future, and that what we do now can start to try and break that path. So it is important to get people there. That's the first one. The second one is we have to build the coalition of resistance now, I think, in the colleges. That if you look at what's happened over the last year with the anti-war, anti-cuts movement, if you look what's taken place, we've had a number of, I think, big successes. That we've had, for example, going back, one of the videos we were just showing, going back just over a year to the student movement that really got the ball rolling in this one. That you then go through a very good TUC called demonstration on March the 26th. 500 to 700,000 people on it, a real cross-section of society led by the trade unions, a process then of going through the June the 30th strikes into the November the 30th strikes, in which actually the trade unions have taken something of a lead in this, and the trade union leadership has actually taken something of a lead in putting themselves at the head of a movement against austerity. If we look at what's happened since the November the 30th strikes, that movement has been thrown into disarray by the fact that a bunch of trade union leaders have basically, in certain cases, lived entirely up to type and decided to give up, walk away and say no more strikes, we're not going to defend pensions, we think we've got the best deal we can. It's thrown the movement into disarray. This is, of course, precisely one of the things that's led the Labour leadership into saying, well, we just have to accept austerity because it sees the movement in disarray and it kind of takes a default position, lurching over to the right somewhere else. So that leaves, I think, in the anti-cuts movement, the absolute necessity to try and create some kind of national framework that offers an alternative to austerity. And at this point in time, the coalition of resistance, I think, is the most credible, the best placed organisation to try and do that. I think it's absolutely central that we try and go from where we are with CORE, which is a number of successes, which is a certain amount of recognition around the country, which is core groups functioning in some places, to saying that this is something that's actually going to be a live campaign on campuses. It's something that people should be a part of. It's something that people can feel like they are a part of, that they're involved with it and they identify with it, and that part of what CORE wants to do over the next month or so is run a kind of tour of the campuses and of local areas to introduce people to CORE, to put on rallies against austerity, against the cuts, to bring in all the people who are still opposed to the cuts, and to offer an alternative to what essentially now the entire mainstream British politics is saying. But that has to also happen, I think, on the campuses. We have to try and get CORE running. We have to set up meetings and rallies and events that are coalition of resistance, that draw in all the people opposed to the cuts. That's the second one. The third one looks a bit like this, and it partly follows from what I think is the disintegration of Labour as a credible kind of social democratic force, as a credible reformist force at this point in time. And it says, actually, the argument now to build Counterfire, I think, is compelling. That if you're serious about trying to change the world, and if you look at what's taken place over the last year and in the last few months, and then you listen to what Ed Miliband and Ed Balls have just said, and how the rest of the Labour Party and its Labour leadership are reacting, then actually the case to try and say, OK, we need to be in a parliamentary organisation, we need to be in the Labour Party to change the world, I think has just disappeared entirely. And then what we should be saying to people is, if you're serious about this, then you need to be an organisation that thinks differently, that puts itself as part of the mass movements, that tries to conduct an argument with those movements, that has a strategy about how you change the world, and that doesn't tie itself to the whims and fancies of Ed Miliband and Ed Balls.